After the name of Hippocrates, I will guess that the most well-known name in the entire 2,000-year history of Western medicine is Galen. Galen left a heritage that has permeated thinking at least until the late 19th century, and in certain ways right into the 20th century. He codified the notion of the humors. He organized it in such a way that one could virtually, if one followed Galenic medicine, predict how one felt from moment to moment during the course of the day by thinking about how much blood, how much black bile, whatever it was in the system. And just the opposite. If one felt a little bit blue, one would automatically say, well, I'm a little melancholic today, not thinking of melancholic in the usual sense of sad, but there is too much of this black bile in me. And if you read the English literature of the 19th century, right until the end of that century, what you come across are references to these words like sanguine, bilious, phlegmatic, melancholic, but much more specifically related to the so-called functional or physiological state than as we do now to the truly literary state. So that's how those words have come down to us, and every time you use one of those words, you should probably think about the heritage of the great Galen. But his heritage wasn't all that innocuous in all cases. His heritage in many ways was disastrous for medicine. So powerful was he, and so influential were his writings and his dominance, that until at least the 16th century, to know medicine was to know the medicine that Galen wrote about and Galen promulgated in the 2nd century of the Common Era. The notion, for example, of predeterminism, the idea that everything is ordained to follow some master plan, that things don't happen just by accident, that there is some force up there in the atmosphere, the stratosphere, wherever, that determines the way things will be, and every observation we make about nature must follow according to that plan. To Galen, the purpose of medical study and the purpose of the research that he did, and he did an awful lot of research in his life, was to learn about nature with the aim of discovering the master plan. Later on, science would content itself with making small observations and seeing how those added up to understand basic principles and theories, but he was making his observations to explain what he considered the goodness of the deity, or as we call it now in modern times after the Greek, the demiurge, the artisan, the creator, the craftsman. That was his notion of God, that God was a craftsman, that he had taken essentially primordial clay and made you and me and the birds and the bees and the flowers and the ants, set everything into motion, but always watched over it. So when Galen, for example, studied the liver, he said it is lying there in the right upper quadrant of the abdomen for a specific purpose, because it's close to the stomach. And when food is digested, it must easily go from the stomach to the liver so that the liver can make blood of it. He believed, for example, that the reason the spleen was under the rib cage on the left side was that it had to balance the liver. It made black bile by his way of thinking, but the real purpose for its location was for balance. So everything he discovered, he said that there's some inexorable plan out there, and the demiurge, who I worship, has set it up this way. Now he, like the Hippocratics, did not believe that the demiurge caused disease or the demiurge cured disease. He continued to be a Hippocratic physician in that sense. But he did believe that there was some God-made, demiurge-made plan. And it was from him that predeterminism crept its way into medical practice, medical theory, and continued until sometime in the 16th and 17th century. One of the most interesting notions about all of this is that even after real experimental medicine was done, people would continue, scientists would continue to look for the demiurge. For example, in the 16th century, it was discovered that acid will dissolve the food in the stomach, specifically protein food, steak, meat, whatever. And yet, the scientists who did that, a certain von Helmont, looked for the fermentation quality, the spiritual quality that the demiurge had put into the acid. He did not go any further than that. There was always the idea of what we've called vitalism, that there's a special essence that is different than can be explained by nature, and we must find that vital force always. So this comes from Galen, though Galen was an heir of Hippocrates. He was not only an heir of Hippocrates, but when he was born, 131 AD, after he was born and studied medicine, he claimed that he was the ultimate heir of Hippocrates, and because Hippocrates had become misunderstood in the, let's say, 400 years since he had died, he, Galen, would bring together all the Hippocratic teachings into his own teachings, and he would improve them. He loved to say that it's easy enough to create a rough road of earth, as Hippocrates did, but it has to be paved with stones so that it can easily be passed over, and that is what I, Galen, will do. I will take the rough road that the Hippocratic physicians created, and I will pave it, and I will leave for you as my heritage the way to get there, the way to understand disease, the way to understand treatment. And if you read my writings, and if you listen to my speeches, and if you look at my experiments, you'll never have to do anything else. To him, the purpose of medical study and research is to learn about nature. That makes sense. He was a Hippocratic physician. But once that research had been done, once those discoveries had been made by Galen himself, there was no need for further research because Galen had discovered everything in perfection and explained it the way the demiurge had wanted it to be and created it. So when he died in 201 AD, he left a body of writings that his successors treated as a form of writ so conclusive that it inhibited further seeking for some 1,500 years. For that period of time, to study medicine was to study Galen. To study medicine was to be imbued with a notion that the humors determine our state of illness and of health, and that one must always be certain that one's humors are in perfect balance or one will be sick. This was true for the laity, this was true for physicians, and only bit by bit did those ideas begin to disappear. There's a charming story about Stonewall Jackson. Here we are in 1863, and he was a bit of a crazy fellow, we're told, and it is said that before a battle or before a major decision, Jackson would raise his arm into the air to drain certain humors out of his arm and get them back to complete balance so that he could think clearly and be perfectly healthy for a battle. Of course, it didn't help him very much because eventually he took a bullet and that was the end of Stonewall Jackson and his humors, but in the middle of the 19th century, people were still doing this kind of thing 1,700 years after Galen's death. That's how pervasive his teachings were. He was believed for reasons that you'll hear about in a moment. After Hippocrates died, about 350 BC, there was this increasingly solid body of Hippocratic teachings that the physicians were increasingly using, including the moral teachings. But as time went on, as the centuries rolled by, those teachings, as they often will in situations like this, became schismed into many different sects. They were what you might call medico-philosophic texts. They were medical philosophic sects because clearly a lot of the Hippocratic medicine had a philosophic basis to it. One accepted the Hippocratic philosophy. It was based on observation, but it was not based on experiment. So essentially you were learning a body of philosophical knowledge, and when that happens, sects clearly will develop. And there were many of them by the 1st and 2nd century AD, and I'd like to read you the names of just a few of them to give you some idea of how confusing the issue was at the height of the Roman Empire. There was the Empiric sect. There was the Pneumatic sect, the Methodists, the Dogmatics, the Eclectics, and then they further subdivided into the Thessalon Methodists, the Pneumatists, Eclectics, and the Erasistratean Pneumatists, and subsects of those subsects, among others. And when Galen came on the scene, and Galen arrived in Rome, as we'll describe in a moment, and he saw all of these sects, he said, "This is terrible. The teachings of the great Hippocrates have been diluted. No one really knows what they are. I'm going to bring them back and, of course, codify them in the books I will write and overcome the various rival sects and bring medicine back to the way Hippocrates really wanted it to be." Some years ago, I was sitting with a very distinguished librarian of medical history in the Medical Historical Library at Yale, and we were talking about Galen. And I said, "What do you suppose of all of the good things that Galen did?" Because as you'll hear, he did some pretty good things. "What do you suppose was the most important contribution he made?" And this man leaned back and puffed on his pipe a little bit, and he said, "Well, he started the whole thing, didn't he?" And yes, but what was it that he started? What he started was the idea that it is good and well to have conceptions of disease based on observation, based on recorded observation that is taught to students. But none of that seems to be focused on the real anatomy, the real structure of the human being. You can treat humors, you can diagnose diseases as the Hippocratics do without even knowing where the bladder is, what the heart looks like when it contracts. And Galen said, we've got to do better than that. We've got to know the real structure of the body, but even more important, we've got to know how the organs function. In other words, we have to know physiology, functioning. And he set out through his life to determine real anatomy and real functioning. And that's what he did devote his life to. And so, of all of his many writings, the one that is most commonly quoted, the one that is most useful actually to modern historians, is one called De Usum Partium, on the uses of the parts of the body. It's renowned because it is Galen at the height of his ability, the height of his contribution, and the height of his really beginning to understand how this body of ours functions. So let me tell you just a little bit about his life. He was born in 130 AD in a town called Pergamon in what is now Turkey. It's about 15 miles inland east of the Aegean. It is still in existence, that town. It's called Bergama in Turkey. Interesting little sidelight of it is that Pergamon had this wonderful library. It was like a little Rome, way out there far from the center of the Roman Empire, but it was like a little Rome. And they had the good library, and they were creating books, and they got short of papyrus one day. So they began writing on the skins of animals, and the city was Pergamon. So they began calling the skins of animals carta pergamana, cards, sheets from Pergamon, and eventually it began to be called pergamentum, and if you recognize a sound, the sound is parchment, because this is where our parchment comes from. It originally comes from Pergamon, which is the city of our heroes, or anti-heroes' birth. His father was Nikon, who was a wealthy architect. I'm not sure where the Nikon company got its name, but it's not impossible that it comes from Galen's father or something similar. He was a wealthy architect. He was a wealthy landowner. There was no particular reason that he should have wanted his son to be a doctor, except for the dream. He had a Hippocratic dream one day telling him that his son should be a doctor. He had named his son Galinos, actually Galen, as we would say it, because Galinos in Greek means calm and serene. And if there is anything that Galen was not, it was calm and serene. He was the most contentious, vain, self-centered, frequently angry man almost in the history of medicine. There were others, but he is probably the most outstanding with all of those traits, as you'll hear in a moment. So his father sends him to study medicine in Pergamon. There's the school there of Hippocratic physicians. He takes the Hippocratic oath, as young men did. And he comes to the great city of Alexandria in 152 when he's 22 years old to study more medicine. He spends 5 years there. He returns to Pergamon in 158, and he gets himself a job because he's now a skilled physician and surgeon. Incidentally, the Hippocratics did not distinguish between physicians and surgeons. He gets himself a job as surgeon to the gladiators in the arena right there in Pergamon. Well, these boys are slashing away at each other, and animals are slashing at them, so he's looking into the body all the time. He couldn't study human anatomy that way because everything was happening so fast and he was trying to treat people, but he did have the opportunity to see hearts beating. He had the opportunity to see the intestine functioning, the peristalsis. He saw arteries pumping away, and he began to develop notions about function, about physiology, about the need to know how these parts work. He finally goes off to Rome in the year 162 when he's 32 years old. Rome at that time was a big city. We forget how large it was. There were 1 million people in Rome in 162, and there were about 1,000 physicians belonging to these various sects that had descended from Hippocrates, and that doesn't count the hundreds of religious healers who wandered the streets attempting to cure disease. There were 150 midwives working, and some of our feminist historians have done very interesting work on just what it was that the midwives did, how they were trained, how they functioned in that society. And in addition, there were about 100 slave practitioners, most of whom were Jews who had been brought back to Rome after the unsuccessful Bar Kokhba revolt of 132. So there they were, all this large number of physicians, and Galen took it upon himself to coordinate everything, to bring everything under one roof, which of course would be the roof of Galen's philosophical and, one might say, scientific house. Well, he'd been well trained. He was very smart. He was a very good doctor for the time. He cured a few people that others could not cure. He made a few diagnoses that others could not diagnose. And before long, there he was, the doctor to the stars. He was the doctor to Marcus Aurelius, as a matter of fact. Later, not right away, but at first he was an important figure in medicine among the wealthiest people of Rome. He was talented, he was arrogant about it. A tendency toward boastfulness was increased during this time. He was vain, scornful not just of the members of these other sects, but of everybody that he thought was of lesser ability than him. He was the original, I won't suffer fools gladly man. And he was known for attacking these sects and attacking them viciously. Well, a plague occurred in Rome after he'd been there for a little bit, bubonic plague. He escaped, went back to Pergamon. He did some more studies in that arena. By now, of course, he was doing studies in the Roman arena too. He returned in 168 when he was 38 years old because Marcus Aurelius asked him to come back to be the emperor's own personal physician. Of the many, many physicians who took care of Marcus Aurelius, Galen was at that time the number 2 in the whole organization. They went together on a military expedition in 168, 169, and from about that time when they came back in 169 until Marcus Aurelius died in 180, 11 years later, Galen did most of the significant work that I'm about to talk about, and he was protected by Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius was his patron, and this was very important because he himself was always being attacked in retribution for the way he was just getting under the skin of virtually everybody. And even after Marcus Aurelius died, later emperors did the same thing, took care of the great Galen to be sure that he was able to pursue his work. Now, his career. If one looks at Galen's writings, he is proclaiming the importance of wisdom, of justice, of fortitude and temperance, but he himself, as I've said, was petulant, he was contemptuous, impatient, he was quick to take offense, he was, what he himself would have said, choleric, had a lot of yellow bile, he was argumentative, he was filled with it. Wonder he wasn't jaundiced. His writings were full of self-promotion. His writings are full of his own autobiography, by which I mean they're full of himself. We know a lot about him because he wrote about himself constantly. But he changed the previous philosophical approach to disease to one that was experimental. Hippocrates had introduced the notion that healing is an art, of course. Galen, during this period of time, introduced the notion that medicine is scientific. It is a science. His system was based on animal dissection, experiments in physiology, observation of patients. Many of these animal experiments he did in public. He did them again and again so that people could see them and understand and recognize how he did them. He was a man of his time, though, and of course, therefore, had philosophical speculations as he made his observations, and we find that some of those observations continue to be so influenced by the notion of predeterminism and that the demiurge is really running things that they were more than imperfect. He approached his observations teleologically. In other words, when he saw something, he believed it fulfilled some grand purpose that he had to discover. The Greeks were vitalists. They believe that living creatures differ from inanimate objects because they're endowed with some special spiritual essence, the life principle. They believed it came from the demiurge. They called it pneuma, P-N-E-U-M-A, from which we derive our word pneumatic. It was some sort of ether inhaled from the universe with the first breath and constantly inhaled for the rest of one's life. It was said to come in through the lungs, to enter the left ventricle, and then it went out in the arteries to bring life to the patient. Many Greeks thought there was no blood in the arteries, except insofar as it leaked in through connections from the veins. So if you found blood in the arteries, it was only because of these connections. They thought the arteries contained this vital spirit, when the vital spirit went up from the heart into the brain, it was converted, they said, and this was Galen's formulation, into something called psychic pneuma, which then went out through the nerves. So we have the nerves carrying psychic pneuma, which tell the body what the brain wants it to know, and we have vital pneuma, which controls organ functions and keeps all of these organs and tissues alive. As Galen studied these formulations more and more, he became increasingly convinced that the function of the veins, especially the big veins leaving the heart and the liver, was to carry the blood that was made in the liver to all structures of the body. So he really had it backwards. Blood to him was going outward and drenching the tissues. Food went into the stomach by his formulation, was digested, went into the liver where it was made into blood, and then out through the great veins to go to the rest of the body, whereas the pneuma was going out through the arteries and the psychic pneuma was going out through the nerves. He never saw a human dissection. Here this man was dissecting, doing experiments, never saw a human dissection except those times in the arena where for moments he would see an open belly, an open head, an open chest. His animals were macaque monkeys, they were dogs, they were cats for these public demonstrations. And he did some great experiments. He demonstrated by vivisection that the pulse beat is related to the heartbeat, which no one had ever known before. He took sections of artery and separated them from veins so there could be no possible connection, opened them up after tying them off above and below, and showed they contained blood. So he said that not only is all of this vital pneuma in the arteries, but there is blood there too. He studied breathing, the mechanics of respiration, by cutting the nerves to the diaphragm, the nerves to the chest wall, to show that the reason our lungs fill with air is that there's a partial vacuum in the chest that expands it, pulling the air down into the lungs instead of the chest getting expanded because the lungs fill up, as had been thought before. It had been thought that urine is formed in the bladder. He tied off the ureters, the tubes that go from the kidneys to the bladder, to show that it's made in the kidneys. He cut the phrenic nerve in the neck that goes to the diaphragm to show that it stops the diaphragm and inhibits the chest from enlarging. He cut the spinal cord at various levels to demonstrate the kinds of paralyses that occurred. He cut the spinal cord up the middle to show that nothing happens when you do that. It had been thought since Aristotle that the voice comes from the heart. Hippocrates thought the voice comes from the brain, but he could never prove it. Well, Galen cut the recurrent laryngeal nerves, the nerves to the voice box. He named them the recurrent laryngeal nerves. He discovered them through his dissections. Then he cut them to show that the voice essentially disappears or became extremely husky. And as he pointed out, voice, thought, comes from the brain. He made a few egregious errors. In his dissecting, he thought in certain animals that he found a coiled network of arteries at the base of the brain, which he called the rete mirabili, which is where the vital pneuma goes up and is turned into psychic pneuma in the brain. He believed this idea about veins bringing blood via ebb and flow to the tissues. And he had a lot of mistakes in the origins and insertions of muscles, and of course his bony structures were all wrong because he was dissecting these animals. His therapeutics were similar to the Hippocratics. He did all of these various heroic things, but he did something more. Whereas the Hippocratics did use medicines, botanicals, he had the idea that if one is good, two is better. If two are better, 15 is amazing. So he would concoct these huge prescriptions, 10, 15, 20 ingredients, usually botanicals, some minerals, oils, things like this, which became known as Galenicals. Right up to the early 20th century, doctors were prescribing Galenicals with a small g. And pharmacists understood that. They kept all of these various herbs and would concoct it for you. And he recorded everything. He left us 22 thick octavo, 6-inch by 9-inch volumes of closely printed material. Ethics, philosophy, religion, contemporary life. It involved everything. But he left us this dictum, quote, "Whoever seeks fame by deeds, not alone by learned speech, need only become familiar at small cost of trouble with all that I have achieved by active research during the course of my entire life," and he was believed. By the 4th century, a few hundred years after his death, he was established as medicine's leading authority and the heir and the interpreter of all of the Hippocratic corpus. And after the Roman Empire became established after 330, after the Roman Empire became established in 330 AD by Constantine in the East, Byzantine physicians translated his Greek writings into Latin. From there, they were translated by the Arabic and Jewish physicians of the medieval period, and the entire canon of medicine during the Middle Ages, whether Arabic, Jewish, or Christian, became ultimately Galenic medicine. His hoary and powerful hand controlled medicine from then on. And as you can imagine, the problems of translating, copying, interpreting, more and more errors crept in. The true revival of Greek learning had to await the conquest of Constantinople by the Greeks in 1543, when Greek scholars escaping to Italy came with some of those original manuscripts, and Europeans began to study Greek again. People had thought over these many centuries only of Galen's philosophical precepts and forgotten that they were based on scientific, repeated experiments. And the irony is that when his reputation was overthrown in the 16th and 17th century, began to be overthrown then, it was by the very experimental methods that he had espoused and that everybody had forgotten about because they were thinking only of his philosophy.